There's been some pennies dropped for me, as I've mentioned. The first one, of course, was Romans 11, when I didn't even realize that God was still interested in Israel. Till about 40 years ago, I was reading Romans 11, verse 1, has God then rejected his people? And the Bible's answer was yes. And I thought, okay, that's a revelation. Oh. My answer was yes, he's rejected his people. Paul's answer was no. So that just changed everything in terms of how I read the Bible, because now Israel was relevant as I read through the Bible. And I discovered that Israel was everywhere. Another penny dropped about 18 years ago. So that was 35 years ago. I went to Israel for my second time in November 2007. And while there, I went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and bought a book, The Case for Israel by Alan Dershowitz. Now, you might notice that we have Alan Dershowitz on the program for tomorrow by Zoom. And I really should apologize to him or ask his permission for stealing his title. I didn't even realize I was doing it. But on the flight home from Israel, I devoured this book, and I learned that Israel has been totally misrepresented in relation to its right to the land. And I had gone right along with this misrepresentation. Some of you remember Qasim Hafiz. I think he worked for B'nai B'rith here. He was at one time an Israel-hating Pakistani Muslim. And he read this book, and it completely transformed him in his view of Israel. Well, I didn't hate Israel. But as I said, Israel was just kind of irrelevant to me, except that I thought it must be a bad actor with regard to the land, and especially with regard to the settlements, which is a real focus of what I want to talk about tonight. So this seminar bubbled up in my mind and in my heart back then, and I think it's still relevant. We see this tsunami of anti-Semitism, and I sense that embedded in so much of it is the fundamental idea in the West is the accusation that the Jews have somehow stolen somebody else's land. And that just bubbles underneath everything else. And Dershowitz showed me that this is absolutely false from a historical perspective, from a legal perspective. And so I've brought those perspectives into this seminar, and I've added a moral perspective and a biblical perspective. Now, when I started out, I said, you know what, I want to keep the Bible out of it, because I want this to appeal to my kids' generation, and they're looking for justice, social justice, and that's where the title comes from, a justice perspective. But I failed miserably in keeping the Bible out of my seminar, and you can probably guess why. That's because when it comes to Israel's history, the Bible is Israel's history. So if you're talking about Israel's history, you're talking about the Bible. And it's an authoritative history. This morning, Itamar was talking about all the bulla, the seals that have been developed. And I had a little list here of all the coins that have been found from the various periods of Israel's history. The pomegranate bell that was found by Robinson's Arch that you know would be on the base of the high priest's gown, his robe. And just recently, Israel is uncovering the Pilgrim Road, which is the road that the pilgrims would have taken from the Pool of Siloam, where they went to cleanse themselves, up to the temple. And so you can now walk on the actual pilgrim road that the Jews of Jesus' day would have walked from the Pool of Siloam mikveh up to the Temple Mount. So here we go. Israel is not an illegal occupier. Here's a picture of the mountains of Israel, and you can just barely see a little outline there of something that you're going to recognize, which we call the West Bank. So Ezekiel in probably the most wonderful prophecy of Israel's return, says, God has him say to the mountains of Israel that you should produce branches and fruit, for my people will soon come home. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord when I keep my promise to the Israelites and bringing them home. So there we have that little outline of the mountains of Israel. And this is the very commonplace political map from today. Could you bring my water up to me, Victoria? I dropped it off there. And you can see how the West Bank there basically is the mountains of Israel. And so I said to myself, how can this be that God is calling his people to come back to this very part of the land that the world tells us belongs to someone else? And so that really got me scratching my head. So we're going to look at this accusation that Israel is illegally occupying the West Bank and even Gaza, even though they haven't been there for so long. And just by the way, from Itamar's presentation, we noticed that the Palestinian narrative is really that Israel is illegally occupying all of the former Palestine. The Western narrative tends to give Israel something, but not the West Bank and not Gaza. So the idea of illegal occupation in the West concerns the West Bank and Gaza. So this is a bit of an old slide here. But Ban Ki-moon, when he was the Secretary General of the UN, said Palestinian frustration is growing under the weight of half a century of occupation and the paralysis of the peace process. It's human nature to react to occupation. And he made that statement in the light of a terrorist attack on a family in Samaria, in the West Bank. A lady named Daphne Meir was attacked by a Palestinian, and she and her teenage daughter tried to fight him off. Daphne died, but her 6 children were protected. And the UN Secretary General said, well, you can understand that. They're frustrated, so they can act out like that. So that was a while back. Today at the UN, we have what we call a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. I don't know what a rapporteur is exactly. I just call her the special accuser of Israel. She says Israel is responsible for one of the cruelest genocides in modern history. On the other hand, Hillel Neuer, who tries to keep the UN accountable, says Israel has been fighting a just war against a terrorist army which cynically embeds itself among civilians. In Barack Obama's time, he also did not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements. He said this construction violates previous agreements and undermines efforts to achieve peace. It is time for these settlements to stop. And that's been the narrative up until Donald Trump, and now we see some movement on Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And here's the speaker announcing that the hills of Judea and Samaria are the rightful inheritance of the Jewish people. But let's go back to the anti-settlement narrative in Canada. This is our current policy on this part of Israel. And this was even our policy under Stephen Harper, who's been the most pro-Israel prime minister that we've ever had, as referred to in UN Security Council resolutions 446 and 465. Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The settlements also constitute a serious obstacle to achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. We're going to talk about the Fourth Geneva Convention later and Security Council resolutions, not those numbers. But that is still our policy. And now we've gone so far as to recognize a state of Palestine. Now, I was sure that I'd seen Mark Carney with a Palestinian flag, and I searched on the internet, and all I could come up with was a little cartoon, so maybe there wasn't one. But that was a very significant move by Canada, and it wasn't well thought out. In his reasons for recognizing the state of Palestine, this was the first one. The pervasive threat of Hamas terrorism to Israel and its people culminating in the heinous terrorist attack of October 7th and Hamas' long-standing violent rejection of Israel's right to exist and a two-state solution. So that's not a reason to give someone a state. That's a reason not to give someone a state. But then he went on with other reasons like Israeli assertiveness in the Judean Samaria region in establishing settlements, and of course denying food to Gaza, which we heard today was a complete fabrication. Israel provided over 2 million tons within even part of that period, and Hamas stole between 85 and 95% of it. So let's go back to the story, beginning with the sense that we must have that God is just. So why would he call the Israelites back to a part of this land that belongs to somebody else? God's works are perfect. All his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong. Upright and just is he. Justice and righteousness he will not violate. And he has a preferential option for the poor. Give justice to the weak and fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. And the Palestinians are suffering. They are suffering. But we don't necessarily need to attribute that to Israel. As we saw clearly in Idamar's presentation, the leadership is leading them astray. So we're going to begin not quite yet with the historical case. We just want to get the geographical case in our mind. This is a map of Canada. All Manitobans know the lakes that we have in Manitoba, some couple of big inland lakes. That is not one of them. That is Israel. That is how small Israel is. So we're arguing over this tiny, tiny little bit of land in the context of Arab Muslim lands that are 600 times the size of Israel. So that's the geographical case. We're going to just take a quick walk through the entire biblical history. It'll just take a couple of minutes with a hiatus, which you'll see in a moment. But very importantly, we begin with Abraham and the covenant he made to give a land to the children of Abraham who became the Israelites. They find themselves in Egypt about 1800, and they find themselves coming out of Egypt in 1350. So from 2000, which is a very rough estimate of Abraham's time, we don't really know, although you can visit the Canaanite gate up in northern Israel now, which Abraham actually walked through. I was just blown away to think that you can actually walk through the Canaanite gate. When Abraham went to rescue Lot in Syria, he went through that Canaanite gate, and they've now uncovered it. So whenever that was, we don't know. But the Israelites didn't come out of Egypt till around 1350. So the question arises, why the wait? 2000 to 1350, that's 650 years. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't really settle the land. They were only sojourners there. Abraham did buy a plot, a cave actually, for his wife. And then the family found themselves in Egypt. And then they were there for 430 years. So a couple of hundred years of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, 430 years in Egypt, only part of that of slavery. And finally, they come out. And so we have to ask, why the wait? And this is to do with God's justice. He is just in his allocation of the lands. He is just. And in Genesis 15, the covenant of the pieces, the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, Egypt. They'll be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So the Israelites are waiting in God's justice because somebody else is in the land and they have not given up their right to the land in God's eyes. God requires justice. He requires justice of Israel in particular. So he also said to Israel, if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. That's from Leviticus 18. And so the reason for the wait is that the sin of the Amorites had not reached its full measure. God was not ready to judge them and throw them out of that land until their sin reached its full measure. That's why the wait. It's all about God's justice. So we come back to the Old Testament, and we're going to see that the Israelites were subject to God's justice. In Deuteronomy, he said, if you keep my commands, then you can stay in the land. If you disobey my commands, I will send you out of the land. And so we find, well after King David, the first exile of the Israelites, which was at the hands of the Assyrian Empire in 722. We call these the 10 lost tribes. The northern kingdom of 10 tribes was dispersed around the Assyrian Empire and really stayed there, lost, until our generation. And now the lost tribes are being found and they're coming back, like the Ethiopians, who we believe are the tribe of Dan, and the sons of Manasseh from India, northwest India, who we believe are the sons of Manasseh. So the first exile was to Babylon, and it lasted the first exile was to the Assyrian kingdom. The second exile was to Babylon, and it lasted 70 years. A very different exile. The southern kingdom of Judah was sent into captivity for 70 years, and some of those people came back. Some of them stayed there. They were very comfortable in Babylon. They didn't come back until 1948, when they were driven out at the hands of Arabs who were so angry with the formation of the state of Israel. But here we see God's justice operating to the detriment, if you like, of the Jews. They are exiled for their disobedience and their idolatry. The Hebrew scriptures close in 430. Then we have another empire come in to Judea and Samaria, Alexander the Great's generals, the Seleucids. They're thrown out by the Maccabees, and we're going to touch on Jewish self-government later under the Maccabees. And then the Romans come along in 63 under Pompey and take over from the Jewish Maccabees. All right, that's 2,000 years of biblical history. Time of Jesus, born we think in 4 before Common Era, died and was raised in 33 Common Era. And as we have already heard alluded to, the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 Common Era, 70 AD, and in 135, the second Jewish revolt. The first Jewish revolt was the temple being destroyed. The second Jewish revolt in 135, the Jews were exiled, and I call that the beginning of the long exile. Roman Empire is still going on in 300 under Constantine. We'll touch on Constantine tomorrow. Muhammad died in 632, and upon his death, the armies that he had gathered came out of Arabia and rapidly conquered the Middle East and northern Africa. And so we have Muslim rule from 632 AD. Sometimes I feel embarrassed saying Common Era. We've been pushed off referring to the time as before Christ and after Christ. So that's all Muslim rule up until 1918, except for the 100 years of the Crusaders. So 1918 is a very critical time in this story of the case for Israel. And you'll notice there that the modern movement of return to Israel, Aliyah, It begins in the 1880s under the Muslims. 1948 is the formation of the state, and forgot to change that date. Oh well. So the long exile from 135, the Second Jewish Revolt, we could say until the 1880s, we could say until 1948, the formation of the state. I like dragging it out a little bit longer because it's like 2,000 years of Old Testament history and 2,000 years of exile. It's not quite 2,000 years, but it's close. It is a long exile. So first of all, there was the Roman, and the Romans divided the kingdom. It's still Roman, but they called it Byzantine in the east. For those dates, the Muslim domination that I spoke of, except for the Crusader period, various Muslim empires from Iraq and from Egypt and from Turkey, of course. And finally, the British Mandate. And that's going to be very critical to our story. Sorry? What was that, Bella? So at the end of the long exile, the Muslim empire that's in control of the region that we're interested in, which we're going to be calling Palestine in a bit, is the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. They started in 1516. They sided with, what were those guys called in World War I? Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Axis. Thank you. So you did learn. The Turks sided with the Axis powers in World War I, and so they were defeated by the Allies, Britain, France, and Canada, and some others. And this becomes very important. Before we see the Middle East region and what happened at the end of World War I just want to give you some context. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson was the President of the United States. He was involved in World War I, and he had 12 points which would make for world peace. And one of them was the determination of people groups. And so that operated in the way that the Allies dealt with the empires that had existed before World War I. So we have a big German empire there, an Austro-Hungarian empire, a Russian empire. The French Empire wasn't really in Europe, it was elsewhere, and same with the British Empire. But in any case, at the end of World War I, look what happened to Europe. It got divided up into a dozen or more new countries, giving different people groups self-determination. And this was going to happen in the Middle East. Self-determination for people groups. But the Allied leaders did not think that those people groups were quite ready for instant statehood, and so they did something called the mandate system. You've heard of the British Mandate, right, in terms of Palestine. Mandate is provincial recognition of a nation subject to administrative assistance until it can stand alone. And the Allies created 26 mandates, 3 of them in the Middle East, a whole raft of them in Africa, and another raft in the South Sea Islands. These mandates were established by the Covenant of the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I. And they were created at something called the San Remo Conference. 50 nations gathered there, led by England, France, Italy, and Japan. Who knew Japan was involved in World War I? I didn't. And they created these mandates. San Remo is a nice little village on the Italian Riviera. It's probably a great place to holiday. And this is what the Allies came up with after World War I, the Middle East mandates. You can see there Syria in orange. That would be given to France to supervise until the people group in Syria were able to govern themselves. And out of Syria also would come Lebanon. Britain got two mandates, Iraq, or they called it Mesopotamia at the time, and Palestine. Now this map is a little misleading. Just pretend it doesn't say Transjordan. Just call it Palestine. So this is the British mandate for Palestine. Looks nothing like Israel today, and you will see why shortly. But the British were given Mesopotamia and Palestine in order to bring them to statehood. And this British mandate for Palestine was based on the very famous Balfour Declaration of 1917. Arthur Balfour was a Christian Zionist. The Prime Minister, Lloyd George, was a Christian Zionist. There was a lot of influential Christian Zionists around Britain, including William Wilberforce, who led the movement to abolish slavery, and the Earl of Shaftesbury, who led the movement to abolish child labor. And these people were all very influential in writing the Balfour Declaration, which said, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other part of the world. So that is code for we're giving Jews the political right to govern Palestine, but we're not taking away the civil rights of the Arabs. The Arabs will have equal rights, but this is going to be a Jewish state. Why are they doing this? Why are they giving the Jews a homeland? This is the text. Whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. So these Christian Zionists in Britain were starting to read their Bible. Before the Reformation, the Bible wasn't even available in the vernacular. But now, some Christians are reading their Bible, they're reading the prophets, and they're saying, look what it says. God gave this land to the Jews, and he's going to bring them back. And so that's what this is all about. They were seeing from the Bible the historical connection of the Jewish people, and they wanted to reconstitute the national home of the Jews in their ancestral homeland. So let's just review Jewish sovereignty over the land. They're the only people group that's ever had sovereignty over that land. Everybody else who's been there has been an empire ruling it from somewhere else, like all those Muslim empires, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. So we know that there were the judges and King Saul that were ruling over the land to some measure, but the first really distinct Jewish sovereignty over the land is what we call the First Temple period. So that was under the United Kingdom of David and Solomon from 1020 to 920, and then a divided kingdom when Solomon's son goofed everything up, and they divided the country into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And that would last till 586, when Nebuchadnezzar came and took the southern kingdom into Israel. So there we have 374 years of Jewish sovereignty over the land. There's some sovereignty in the Second Temple period. It's not quite as clear. But when the Jews came back from Babylon, they had a kind of a joint rule with the Persians. It wasn't the Babylonians anymore. The Persians had taken over from the Babylonians, and so now it was Persian Jewish rule for 206 years until the Seleucids came along, the Greeks, and they conquered Judah. Then the Hasmoneans rose up when Antiochus Epiphanes got really extreme and tried to wipe out Judaism, sacrifice pigs in the temple, all of that Hanukkah story. And the Maccabean family led the Jews in revolt, and they would rule, a Jewish rule, over Judah for another 104 years until the Romans took over. So that's a total of 684 years. So that's not forever. There was all kinds of empires ruling in Israel's past, but the Jews are the only people who have had an indigenous sovereignty over that land. This is the extent of Israel, Eretz Israel, it's called here, under Solomon. It takes in quite a bit of Syria and Jordan. We've heard in recent days about Greater Israel. Came up with Tucker Carlson's interview with Mike Huckabee. And Mike Huckabee wasn't defending Greater Israel. He's just saying, well, that's what God said. And what strikes me is that, except maybe under Solomon, Israel has never tried to expand its borders. Whenever Israel has expanded its borders, it's been in response to a defensive war. So somebody attacks them, and we're going to see that later, and they defend themselves and end up winning territory. It happened in 1948, and it happened in 1967. So I think it's quite marvelous just to see that God has promised this enormous territory, and yet Israel's not fighting for it. You might say Israel's waiting for it, maybe when the Messiah comes. Although that doesn't quite fit, because I think it's going to be the whole world when Messiah comes. Anyway, Israel has not ever been aggressively seeking to expand its own territory. So the first reasoning for giving Palestine to the Jews was because of this history of Jewish sovereignty in the land, 684 years. The second reason was that there has always been a Jewish presence in the land. We know that in the time of Jesus, there was 2,500,000. When the Romans expelled the Jews, there was just, we don't know, but a few thousand left. So this chart says there were 5,000 in 1517, 295,000 non-Jews. 1882, when modern Aliyah begins, 24,000 Jews, 275,000 non-Jews. And we'll look at this discrepancy, this majority of non-Jews. They're Arab by this time because of the Muslim conquest. 1918, when all this is happening, we haven't got to what's happening yet, but something big is happening. 60,000 Jews and 600,000 non-Jews. And it goes up and up and up. And I didn't adjust this chart either, but there are 8 million Jews in Israel today and 2 million Arabs. First reason is Jewish sovereignty. Second reason is continuous Jewish presence. And the third reason was that the Jews have never stopped longing for their homeland. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. And so the Allies at the end of World War I said, we're going to give self-determination to people groups. We're going to give the Arabs Mesopotamia and Syria. We're going to give the Germans and the Hungarians and the Romanians and all these people in Europe their own country. And we're going to give Palestine to the Jews. So I've got a lovely little video here. They've been doing some celebrations of San Remo. The 90th anniversary was 2015. This is the 100th anniversary. So let's just see what went on there. I've never run a...
It happened on April 25th, 1920. Representatives of the great powers who triumphed in World War I met in the Italian town of San Remo to divide the Middle East lands they conquered. 100 years later, the leaders of the great powers who came to San Remo are long gone, but their decisions made history and transformed the Middle East. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, they called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in an area called Palestine. Before its defeat in World War I, the 400-year Ottoman Empire spread throughout the Middle East. In San Remo, England, France, Italy, and Japan, along with the United States as an observer, divided the empire into 3 mandates: Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. France would oversee Syria, while Iraq and Palestine fell under Great Britain. The resolution also included the Balfour Declaration, written by England's Lord Balfour in 1917, which called for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. One English diplomat, Lord Curzon, called it Israel's Magna Carta. Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann considered it so important, he said the modern state of Israel was born on the 25th of April, 1920, in San Remo. It was adopted by the League of Nations and signed by 51 countries. Exclusive legal and political rights in Palestine went to the Jews, while those rights in the rest of the Middle East went to the Arabs.
Is it shows, in fact, the creation of a Jewish national home was widely backed by the international community way back then.
Former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Dori Gold, told CBN News the history of San Remo 100 years ago has largely been forgotten.
That's part of Israel's problem. Why is it that it's fighting for its legitimacy all the time? It's because the international treaties and agreements on which the state of Israel is based have been forgotten. Our role is to remind the international community what are Israel's legal rights. What is the basis for the legitimacy of the modern Jewish state? And for that, San Remo is pivotal.
Gold says Israel's adversaries are trying to rob Israel of its right to exist by rewriting history.
I think now people will have to learn this history properly and not allow some professor or some media figure to distort what went on 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it was clear as day that the restoration of a Jewish national home was supported by the majority of countries in the world.
This is really forgotten history. When we talk about the right to the land, usually we go back to 1948, and that's a huge mistake. A huge mistake. This was pivotal. Just as the formation of Hungary or Romania or Latvia or Lithuania was legitimate in international law with the Treaty of Versailles and the Covenant of the League of Nations, so is Israel's formation, although it was the intervening mandate step that was different from Europe. You follow me? So there we have the British Mandate for Palestine, 1920, San Remo. It wasn't long before things changed drastically, and this stunned me. There was always restlessness between the Arab and Jewish worlds, and so the British convened the Cairo Conference just all on their own, and they added Article 25 to the San Remo resolution, which said that if and this happened, I think basically probably due to relative populations, then things could change. And so in 1921, 77% of the Jewish homeland was detached from it and given to the Arabs under a sheikh named Abdullah. His brother Faisal had been given Mesopotamia. His dad was the Sheikh of Arabia, and so he got Jordan, which was 77% of the original Jewish mandate. So that was kind of a penny dropping for me. I said, two-state solution. We have one right there. So now the land that we're dealing with looks a little bit more like the Israel that we're used to, without the carve-outs of the West Bank, of course. So that's what's left in 1921 for a Jewish homeland, which isn't yet a state. It's still being supervised by the British. So now we're going to look at what happened up until this major change in 1948, the War of Independence, and 1947, of course, the partition. There was continuous Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine. For some reason, the British appointed a man, a clan leader named Haj Amin el-Husseini, as both the religious leader and the political leader of the Arabs of Palestine. And you probably know a little bit about him. He was radically opposed to the Jews. I would say he was a Jew hater. He spent World War II in Germany with Hitler, and he offered to bring the final solution to the Middle East. And so he was the political and religious leader of the Arabs, and they resisted with all their might Jewish settlement, Jewish immigration. So, for example, in 1929, they massacred, I've had 67, Itamar this morning had 87 Jews in Hebron, and many more would have been killed, except that several Arab families protected the rest of the Jews. The consequence of that massacre was that all the Jews were kicked out of Hebron by the British and sent up to Jerusalem. So it's like a backwards consequence. The British were very frustrated with the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews, and so they had a commission called the Peel Commission in 1937. And their proposal was to have another two-state solution, to divide the land between Jews and Arabs. And that's what their partition would have looked like. The purple is for the Jews, so it's Galilee and the coast. The green is for the Arabs, so it's the mountains of Israel and the Negev, and the area between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is an internationally governed area. One thing that I wanted to make you aware of was this area called the Mountains of Israel is also known as the Biblical Heartland. So the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is essentially where the Old Testament took place. Jerusalem, Hebron, Shiloh, where the tabernacle rested for 369 years, Bethel, Shechem, all of those biblical cities are in the West Bank. And it boggles my mind that the international powers that be felt that that wasn't the obvious land to give to the Jews. But both in this Peel Commission partition and the next one we're going to see, the one that almost took effect in 47, it's the Arabs who are given the biblical heartland. Very strange. So the Peel Commission was not accepted by either party. The Jews were kind of willing. They weren't totally happy, but the Arabs were completely against it. So the British soldiered on, but then they started to back away even from the idea of a mandate. And so they proposed a white paper in 1939 that said it is not part of His Majesty's government's policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. So the British are really waffling here. Finally, in 1947, they've had enough. The war is over. They are broke. They are tired. And this problem between Jews and Arabs is something that they don't need. So they basically just take the mandate for Palestine and dump it in the lap of the United Nations. We saw that. So what is the United Nations going to do? Well, they appointed a committee called the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, and they were 14 neutral nations. Canada was pressured to become part of it, even though Canada really was not interested and was pretty anti-Semitic. But the U.S. pressured Canada to be on that committee. And so these 14 nations wrestled together with what to do about the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine. And tomorrow, when I talk about the history of Jewish-Christian relations, I'm going to tell you the Zion Apostolic Church of Winnipeg's connection to the UNSCOP Committee and the birth of Israel. I call it the Canadian connection to Israel's rebirth. Or actually, I like to call it the Winnipeg connection to Israel's rebirth. Anybody heard of Zion Apostolic Church? You go there. Oh, yeah. So what happened with the partition proposal? Sorry, I didn't go over that. So this is a little bit like the Peel Commission proposal. The Arabs are still getting the biblical heartland, sadly. They're also getting a big chunk of Galilee. So the Arabs are getting the gray. The white is for the Jews. The Arabs also get Gaza and a strip along the Philadelphia corridor or whatever that is there, I'm not sure. But now there's a big change, and the Jews are getting the Negev desert. So that is what the UN proposed in 1947 to solve the conflict between Arabs and Jews. So what happened? We know what happened. First of all, to give you the details, this proposed Jewish state by the UN Special Committee was 13% of the original mandate for Palestine. So I said that 77% had gone to become Jordan, and now what's left of the 23% is getting chopped again, so that we're 13% of the original mandate, of which 60% is desert. So I like to say it was kind of a broom closet that the Jews were finally left with the partition plan. Just a little, somebody at San Remo called it a niche. We're giving the Jews a niche in this massive Arab, Muslim Middle East. But Israel accepted the broom closet. And 6 months after accepting it, November 29th was when they accepted it, then they declared independence in May 14th, 1948. But the Arabs rejected the plan. We saw from Itamar's presentation that there really isn't an option for the Muslims to have any Jewish state there in their theology. It's got to be all theirs. And so it was impossible for them to accept this two-state solution, or this is now the third state solution after Jordan. And so all of their allies from the 5 surrounding countries joined the civil war that was already going on between Jews and Arabs in 1947 and 8, and they attacked the fledgling Jewish state on May 15th. So they didn't even give them 24 hours to enjoy their horrors in the street. They attacked them from 5 surrounding countries. Amazingly, Israel won the war after 15 months and 6,000 casualties. So 1% of their population was killed, and it took them 15 months, but they defeated 5 regular armies from the surrounding nations. Absolutely amazing. This is in French for some reason. On the left is the UN partition plan. So you can see it, instead of gray, now the Arab part is green. So there's the biblical heartland is green, Gaza, and so on and so forth. After the war, the Jews had pushed the Arabs back significantly. So along the Egyptian border, they took all that land. They widened out. They took away a significant chunk of the biblical heartland around Jerusalem, all that pink, and all that of Galilee that was supposed to be Arab was now taken by the Jews in a defensive war. According to the rules of war, if your neighbor attacks you and you fight back and you take some of his territory, he can't say, oops, didn't mean that, I'd like my land back. It's yours, according to the internationally recognized laws of war. And so all of that land that Israel took in the War of Independence was now part of what we know as Israel. And the green line would be around that pink part that expands the biblical heartland. So Israel carries on, 1948, and begins to build their state. There's almost 1 million Jews kicked out of the Arab world in the fury of the Arab world over this War of Independence. And Israel absorbed probably 600,000 of them. Some of them went to the U.S., but Israel put them in tents. They almost starved. There was almost nothing to eat, but Israel absorbed those 600,000 refugees from the Arab world in their first 2 years of being a state. And so they built, and they got stronger, and they got stronger. And so 1948 to 67, that would be 15 years later. Hey? The Arab world decided they would have another go at trying to abolish and wipe out the Jewish state. And we all know what happened. I'm going to go over the kinds of things that were being said because Israel actually attacked preemptively. If you remember, they snuck down to Egypt just a few meters off the Mediterranean with their air force, and they demolished the Egyptian Air Force on their tarmac while the pilots were at breakfast. So Israel saw that they were being surrounded by these 3 regular armies, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And they said, we are going to be absolutely wiped out if we don't do something. And the international community said they were not the aggressors. Even though they acted first, what was going on around them was such that we do not call them the aggressors. And so this is what the Arabs were saying. The sole method we shall apply against Israel is total war, which will result in the extermination of Zionist existence. And Israel was digging mass graves in the parks of their cities. They really expected massive casualties from the tanks that were lined up all around Israel. And Egypt had asked the UN peacekeepers to leave the Sinai Peninsula. They had closed off the Straits of Hormuz, which is actually a cause of war, casus belli. I'm just making the case that Israel was not the aggressor in this war. Syria said, I, as a military man, believe the time has come to enter into a battle of annihilation. Iraq said the existence of Israel is an error that must be rectified. So Israel decided to act before it got annihilated. The international community recognized that that was a defensive war. And in 6 days, not 15 months like 1948, in 6 days, Israel defeated those 3 regular armies. All the green there is land that they took in a defensive war. The huge area of the Sinai, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank. Jordan had called it the West Bank because Jordan is the east bank of the Jordan River, so they just occupied the biblical heartland and called it the West Bank, and the Golan Heights was all taken from the Arabs in a defensive war in 1967. Absolutely miraculous. Included in what Israel took back was the old city of Jerusalem. Under partition, Jerusalem was cut in half in 1948, and there was a big concrete and barbed wire fence down the middle of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount and the old city was all under Jordan. But in the Six-Day War, almost without trying, the old city fell into the hands of the IDF. And you know the cry that Temple Mount is in our hands. And there are the soldiers praying at the Western Wall. So at the end of the Six-Day War, Israel agreed to make peace under Security Council Resolution 242. This was a big debate, which we'll come to in a minute. But the Arabs refused to negotiate. We call it the Three No's of Khartoum. They met in Khartoum. They wouldn't come to, I forget where the UN was meeting, but they said no. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. If we look at the pattern, which we'll see later, Israel would have been ready to give back land to the Arabs in these negotiations. That was typical of Israel. They wanted to look good in the eyes of the world. They didn't want to be seen as an aggressor. So even the Temple Mount, as soon as they took the Temple Mount back from Jordan, they immediately turned around and gave the Temple Mount back to the Jordanian Waqf of Jordan. So that's why today Jews are having difficulty praying on the Temple Mount. So there's no negotiation, there's no dealing with the Arabs. And so what is Israel going to do? They've taken it over, they've occupied it. So they set up a military administration of these occupied territories. Notice I'm not saying illegally occupied territories, pending negotiations whenever they're going to happen. Under Israeli occupation, conditions improved dramatically for the Palestinians. They're just starting to be called Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank. In fact, the Palestinian areas were the fourth fastest growing economy in the 1970s. So Israel did not mistreat the people that they had inadvertently occupied in this defensive war. So that begs the question of what's happening since then. Well, that huge area of the Sinai, Israel gave back to Egypt in 1979. Because of Egypt's willingness to make peace with Israel, they were kicked out of the Arab League. And 2 years later, Anwar Sadat was assassinated. So it's not popular to make peace with Israel in the Arab world. Much later, 1994, there was a peace treaty with Jordan. All kinds of water rights were dealt with. But the legal status of what was formerly the West Bank under Jordan was not settled. And we'll look at that in a minute. In fact, we'll look at it right now. So after that peace treaty with Jordan, the Oslo Accords came to be. And the idea was that Israel was going to gradually withdraw from the West Bank, give it over to the Palestinians, and they would have their state. In the beginning, 98% of the Palestinian people were put under the civil authority of the Palestinian Authority. So Ramallah and Bethlehem and Jenin and what's another big city? All the cities were put under the PA. And then the rest was divided into areas A, B, and C, where the PA had Area A, total control. Israel had military control in Area B, but the Palestinians had civil control, and then Israel had total control of Area C down south. So we said, what in the world was Britain doing putting Palestine's Muslims under Hajj Amin al-Husseini? Well, now we have to ask, what in the world was the U.S. doing in putting Yasser Arafat in charge of the Palestinian Authority? He had founded Fatah in 1959. He was a creative guy. He invented airplane hijacking. He's kind of the founder of terrorism. And yet, he's put in charge of the PA, who's going to make peace. They're going to peacefully coexist with Israel. And this is Arafat's heart. When he's invited to Israel in 1994, not Israel, but to the West Bank, to take over the PA there. You understand that we plan to eliminate the state of Israel to establish a purely Palestinian state. We'll make life unbearable for Jews by psychological warfare and population explosion. I have no use for Jews. They are and they remain Jews. So that's in 1996. So, under the Oslo Accords, there is an effort to try to work out the status of the West Bank, which had been left in limbo when Jordan lost the Six-Day War. So we have the Camp David Summit in 2000 with Arafat, Bill Clinton, and Ehud Barak. Israel offers 93% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza. Arafat says no, doesn't make a counteroffer, returns to the West Bank, and they start the second intifada in Israel itself with the bus bombings and the suicide bombings in restaurants and wedding receptions and all of that. That was his response to an offer of almost all of what we think of as the Palestinian territories. They tried again in 2001 at Taba, which is down by Egypt. There was no success there. So Israel was not very encouraged by trying to make a deal with the PA, and so they did something which we now know was tragic. In 2005, they created another two-state solution by withdrawing themselves completely from Gaza in 2005. The disengagement. Not one Jew was left, not one IDF soldier was left in Gaza. They said, there's your state, take it away, create your Singapore of the Mediterranean. That wasn't a negotiation. Israel just said, we're going to make a grand gesture for peace. We're going to show the world that we want peace. And this is what we got. We got October 7th, following all of those other Gaza wars that we've had through the years. Itamar referred this morning to two negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas. I'm not sure the second one, but I know that in 2008, Ehud Olmert negotiated with Mahmoud Abbas and upped the ante, if you like, from 93% with Arafat in 2000 to 97% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza, the 3% of the West Bank that Israel wanted to keep. They would swap other territories to make it effectively 100% of the West Bank. And Jerusalem was going to be divided, I believe. Thank you. Yeah. Jerusalem was a big deal in the Muslim mind for sure. And Olmert just walked away. Wouldn't sign the map that Barak had brought with these boundaries. He just walked away, and nothing happened. This is Mahmoud Abbas in 2008. Did I say Arafat? Olmert did not walk away. Abbas walked away. So this little chart shows the Palestinian answer to Israel's peace offers. Remember the Peel Commission back in 1937 under the British? The answer was no. The Jews weren't that keen about it either, but they were willing. 1947, the Jews accepted, the Arabs said no. 1967, the three no's of Khartoum. The Arabs refused to negotiate after the Six-Day War. Camp David, no. Taba, no. 2008, the secret offer, no. And I did update this chart, but I didn't get it in my presentation. So, over and over again, Israel has tried to give up land to solve this problem. And now we know why it's not working, because we listened to Itamar, and we understand that it's all or nothing for the Muslims. It's all or nothing. They do not want a Jewish state of any size in that land.